how to get lean for good, how to lose fat, how to achieve your physique goals without fail. I realize it's 2024, and so many of you are still asking what the best method is to lose fat. What's the best way to get lean and defined, meaning having visible abs if you're a man, or getting rid of fat on your stomach and hips if you're a woman. Some will tell you intermittent fasting, no, the keto diet, no, the carnivore diet, organic, 10,000 steps a day, no, 15,000 steps a day. Anyway, I can understand why you'd be drowning in such a sea of information overload coming from all sides. But what if I told you that, in reality, all those diets I just mentioned are just tactics, just different ways of applying a much broader theory, one that's scientifically established and proven, and if you understand it, it will allow you to see the whole picture and stop taking part in these endless tribal wars. I'm going to try to make this video, the one I wish I'd found about 8 years ago, back when I first started getting interested in improving my physique and becoming more aesthetic. When I started, it was pretty simple. Like a lot of people, I wanted a physique that was close to Cristiano Ronaldo's. I wanted a lean, chiseled physique with prominent abs, a little bit of muscle to make it look aesthetic, but not too much. And today, the physique I'm able to maintain every day, which is my own, is this one. It's a physique I'm very happy with, that I'm even very proud of, but I think I made every mistake in the book before getting to this physique. And as proof, I went through this physique, and this one, and even this. Now, they're not catastrophic physiques or anything. In and of itself, I never felt bad in my own skin, but we're still a long way from a CR7 style physique. And what's interesting is that if you take these photos, well, in fact, there's only a 2-year difference between the first and the last one. These are from my last 2 years. All this to say that in reality, out of the 8 years I've been training, there were probably 6 where I was just making mistakes left and right. So in the 8 years of training, only 2 were spent applying the right theory. But what's also interesting is that it shows that if you potentially opt for the right application of things, in just a few years, you can achieve a physique similar to mine. And I don't have any exceptional genetics or anything. So it's achievable. The goal of this video is to give you the keys to understand how your body works and to try to reach your goals and maintain the body you love living in for as long as possible. And I'm really going to try to do this without defending any particular dietary dogma, without telling you, watch out, no carbs, no sugar, no saturated fats, or whatever. What many dietitians or even coaches forget is that the golden rule, the #1 principle, is adherence. You have to understand that if you want to get a result and keep it for as long as possible, anything that's an extreme, very short, ultra-rigid diet that will ruin your social life or that could compromise your mental health or even create eating disorders, all of that should be banned. Let's start with the basics. Every day, your body expends energy. This is what we call TDEE, or Total Daily Energy Expenditure. Your body also absorbs energy every day from the food you provide it. If you expend more energy than you consume, then your body will burn energy. If you expend less energy than you consume, your body will store energy. And if you expend as much energy as you absorb, you'll be at equilibrium. When you're in a caloric deficit, it means you're expending more energy than you're absorbing. And to make up for this shortfall, your body will simply tap into its energy reserves. Your body will start by using what's called glycogen, a form of glucose stored in your muscles and liver. And once the glycogen stores are depleted, the body will tap into its fat reserves. The fats are then broken down into fatty acids, which are subsequently used as an energy source for your muscles and organs. If the caloric deficit is too severe, it's possible for the body to start breaking down muscle proteins and therefore tap into your muscles. But this is a misconception you hear far too often on social media. People get the impression that as soon as you're in a caloric deficit, well, your body immediately starts breaking down muscle. In reality, that's false. First, you tap into glycogen very quickly, then into fat, and in the case of a very severe deficit, it is indeed possible to tap into muscle, but most of the time, you'll be tapping into fat. Okay, so far, nothing new under the sun. These are concepts you're probably already familiar with. Caloric deficit, caloric surplus, caloric maintenance, and so on. But the entire key to the theory lies in understanding how to precisely calculate your TDEE and how to precisely calculate your expenditure. Because yes, calories, many of you already know how to track them. There are plenty of tools for that, and we'll come back to that later anyway. But the amount of calories you're supposed to ingest will always depend on the energy you've expended. And so, yes, tracking your calories is great. It's a very good method. But if you don't track your expenditure as well as you track your calories, well, then it's pointless. And for me personally, that's something that held me back for a huge number of years. And I say this because the margins can be incredibly slim. Imagine you're aiming for a deficit of about 250 calories, and you think your TDEE is around 2,500 calories. So you set your intake at around 2,250 calories. Now imagine that in reality, your actual TDEE, because you miscalculated, is at 2,200 calories. Well, in that case, there is zero chance, and I mean zero, that you will be able to lose weight. This just goes to show you how crucial, how incredibly important it is to calculate your expenditure perfectly to be sure you're going to lose weight. So to sum up, precisely calculating your TDE is probably what will unlock all the barriers to achieving your goals. So what is TDE made of? TDE is broken down into 4 parts. First, and most importantly, is the BMR, or Basal Metabolic Rate, which is your basal metabolism. Next, we have NEAT and EAT, which kind of go together. NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, is the energy spent on non-exercise activities. And EAT, exercise activity thermogenesis, is the energy spent on exercise activities. Then, last, we have TEF, TEF, the thermic effect of food, and it's basically the energy you'll use to digest food. To calculate your TDEE, you'll need each of these components, and that's where it gets a little complicated in terms of the math, but don't worry, we'll go over all of that together. In the top right of the screen, I'm going to put a sort of small map so you don't lose track and we can easily follow along. We'll start right away with BMR, Basal Metabolic Rate. So this is your metabolism. It's the energy your body expends when you're at rest. Imagine you're lying in a bed for 24 hours. Well, the energy you expend would be your metabolism. It's the energy your body provides to keep your organs, your brain, your liver, your blood circulation, and so on, functioning properly. To determine your BMR, there are tons of formulas. And right there, the first pitfall to avoid is using the right equation. We're in 2025, and the equation that's still most commonly used is the Harris-Benedict equation. The Harris-Benedict equation is one that we simply know is outdated and has been for over 20 years. It's the one that's still most widely used on social media by coaches and influencers. It's the most used equation in calorie tracking apps, and it's also the equation recommended in dietitian schools, which we know are seriously behind the times. To give a little context, we're just after the First World War in 1919, and Harris and Benedict developed a protocol that was very innovative for its time. A sample of 239 men and women lying in a bed, not moving, with a mask to calculate the amount of oxygen consumed. Because basically, the energy consumed by the body is proportional to the amount of oxygen used. They calculated the BMR of each subject to derive a general rule based on the following factors: weight, height, age, and sex. For the time, it was very innovative, but there are a lot of problems with this Harris-Benedict equation. First, the sample is extremely small. 239 people who came from the same area, or more precisely, the same city, Boston, in the United States. The initial data is from the early 20th century, when lifestyles were very different from today's. There was far less obesity than there is today, for example. And we can even say we're talking about men and women from the World War I era, with hormone levels, weight, body fat, and fat mass that were very different from our current standards. Furthermore, the indirect calorimetry used to calculate oxygen consumption was very inaccurate at the time. And in fact, since then, many studies have shown that the Harris-Benedict equation leads to an overestimation of the basal metabolic rate. I'll put all the studies in the description, by the way. So why an overestimation? We're going to try and understand that together. In a century, as you can imagine, we've made absolutely enormous progress in determining metabolism. And in 1980, Cunningham had the incredible idea to conduct his experiments not by varying the subject's weight, but by varying their lean mass, which is the mass of the human body once you've removed the fat mass. Because, in fact, Cunningham had realized that fat mass expends very, very little energy compared to the rest of the body. And that's where you can clearly see the problem with metabolism equations like Harris and Benedict, which only take weight into account. We're going to have a tendency to overestimate the BMR because we're assuming that fat mass expends energy in the same way that other parts of the body do. And so, for example, if we take a man who's about 1.80 m, overweight, 120 kilos, with 30% body fat, and we use the Harris-Benedict formula, well, we'll find a BMR of 2,500 kilocalories. Whereas if we use the Cunningham equations, we'll be at 2,000 calories. The difference is absolutely huge. 500 calories, that's not insignificant, it's huge. And I'm really stressing this part because, as we'll see later, NEAT and EAT, which are the energy expenditures from exercise and non-exercise activities, also depend on your metabolism. So calculating your BMR is going to be crucial. And after Cunningham, and over the last 40 years, scientists have even managed to very precisely calculate the expenditure of each component of the human body, which I'll display for you here. The liver, the brain, the heart, the kidneys, the muscles, adipose tissue, and the rest. And so, what's striking here is that muscles represent the largest expenditure in our metabolism, and we can also see that fat mass only accounts for a very small part, and body fat is going to be very important. Let's imagine we have two people of the same sex, same age, let's say two men who weigh 80 kilos. One has 30% body fat, the other has 10% body fat. Well, the first one will have a BMR of 1500, while the other will have a BMR of 1900. It is therefore imperative to know your lean body mass to properly calculate your metabolism. There will always be inaccuracies due to the body fat calculation, of course, but you will greatly reduce the uncertainty surrounding the BMR by using formulas that include body fat, and you'll be much closer to the real number. And so to determine your lean mass, it's quite simple. In relation to your weight, you just take your weight and subtract your fat mass. So for example, the formula would be weight times 1 minus the body fat percentage. If you're at 15% body fat at 80 kilos, well, your lean mass will be 80 times 1 minus 0.15, which equals 68 kilos. And now, the new challenge is going to be to determine your body fat with precision and simplicity. And here, once again, be careful because there are many pitfalls. I'm going to show you 4 techniques and recommend only one of them at the end. The first technique, you're probably familiar with it, is the skinfold caliper. There are tons of videos about this on YouTube, and it's very well known because in fact it works very poorly. It's extremely imprecise and there's a lot of room for user error. On that topic, I'd actually recommend watching Nassim Sahili's video, which is very good on the subject, but I'm not going to dwell on it because it's a technique that just works very badly. Next, the famous bioimpedance scale. This thing is the scam of the century. For me, it's kind of the thing where you wake up one morning, you're not feeling too confident, you go weigh yourself, you see a single-digit body fat number on it, and you walk away full of confidence. It's great. But no, kidding aside, the bioimpedance scale is a scale that you stand on and a weak current will be injected into your body and it will simply calculate the resistance. That's extremely imprecise. The relationship between human body resistance and body fat is already an absolutely gigantic approximation. And depending on whether you are hydrated or not, it can vary by sometimes 10%. That's extremely imprecise. And to prove to you that I told you I've potentially made every mistake imaginable, you should know that I, at one time, bought perhaps the most expensive impedance measurement scale. From the market, it was several €100. It hurt me a lot at the time, but I was very happy because I thought, finally, I will be able to calculate my body fat accurately and use good equations, etc. And to my surprise, every single time I got up in the morning and weighed myself, I always saw on my body fat measurement, which I'll show it to you on the screen in just a moment, I always saw either 6 or 7%. Sometimes it was 6% and other times it was 7%, but it was always within that range. How can I put it? Actually, I looked like this at that time, so in fact, absolutely not 7%. 7% body fat, for example, is more like that actually. So we were very far away. And I know that this can hurt for some of you because you have potentially invested a large amount of money in what are, in quotes, cutting-edge electronic devices. And there comes a point where you try to convince yourself that yes, I have 7% body fat, that's what my scale tells me, that's it. No, at some point you have to resign yourself and say it simply doesn't work. So a scale, whether it's a pedensimeter or not, it's not meant to calculate your body fat, it's meant to weigh yourself, and that's all. The third technique will be the DEXA scan. You've probably already seen plenty of videos about this on YouTube. It is simply the best current technology for determining body fat. In fact, it's going to be like a kind of X-ray that you're going to have, where they're going to send very low intensity X-rays to measure your bone density and body composition. It's the best technique, but it's extremely expensive. Each session costs approximately €100, and ideally it should be done every week. And these are devices that, unfortunately, are not yet available everywhere. The fourth option is the one I will recommend, which for me is the most valid, is simply to determine your own body fat. One option is to look in a mirror and determine your body fat using a chart, as there are several available on the internet. But this remains a rather difficult exercise because it is sometimes quite complicated to have an honest view of oneself. The method I recommend and currently use is to use apps that perform body scans, or you can choose. In the photo, there are artificial intelligence models that have been trained and will be able to determine your body fat based on a huge database of people who have already had DEXA scans. For example, I use the Lean app, which works extremely well. I just have to take a picture of myself, and that's how I calculate my body fat every week. Now, we can determine our BMR, our basal metabolic rate, based on weight and body fat. I use the equation that's directly in the Lean app because it's one of the best equations available. You can also use another app where you'll be specifically asked to provide your weight and your body fat. If you only provide your weight, you should avoid it because you'll be directed more towards Harris-Benedict type equations, which are unfortunately inaccurate. So you can use other types of applications. Otherwise, one of the equations I can recommend, which isn't the best one currently, but is still pretty good in a pinch, is a revised version of the Cunningham equation, which is as follows. It's your lean mass times 21.6 plus 430. And so with body fat, that would be your weight times 1 minus your body fat times 21.6 plus 430. And so to close the chapter on BMR, there are 2 pitfalls to avoid: apps that use Harris-Benedict type equations and don't take body fat into account. But how can you recognize these specific apps? In most calorie tracking apps, your BMR will be calculated almost systematically using the Harris-Benedict formula. And then they'll simulate the other expenditure items, which are NIAT, EAT, and TEF, using a multiplier of the BMR. You've probably seen it on calorie apps where they ask you, are you active, somewhat active, very active, or very sedentary? Well, in fact, when you tap one of those boxes, they'll apply a multiplier to your BMR to try and simulate the other items, which are NEAT, EAT, and TEF. But in reality, it's a highly imperfect approximation because from one week to the next, and even from one day to the next, your expenditure can be completely different. One day, you might be completely sedentary and spend an afternoon Netflix and chilling, and the next day, you could be at Disneyland and walk 15 kilometers. You have to be careful. These equations don't really apply well, they don't fit well in the short and medium term, and in truth, not even in the long term. The difference from one day to the next can sometimes be more than 1,000 calories, and so apps like this don't tell you whether you should eat more based on your daily activity level or not. And so, as you've probably gathered, a completely skewed BMR formula plus an approximation of expenditure items means you have absolutely no chance of reaching your goals if you use an app with this method. And I'm telling you to be careful because this is what held me back for many years. I was using apps that were too general, too mainstream, and that give you an expenditure rate that's pre-evaluated, preset, but which actually turns out to be completely wrong. And so, by thinking it's totally reliable, well, you get it wrong, and you end up not controlling the exact calories you should be eating at all. So for that, be very careful about the app you use. We're now going to move on to NEAT. The concept of NEAT actually goes hand in hand with the concept of EAT. There's expenditure related to non-exercise and expenditure related to exercise. To understand exactly what separates the two categories, you need to understand the concept of MET, metabolic equivalent task, which actually measures the intensity of a physical activity by comparing its energy expenditure to that of the basal metabolic rate at rest. So for every activity, whether it's an everyday activity or a clearly physical athletic one, a MET has been calculated for that activity. And so what's going to differentiate an exercise from a non-exercise is the MET value of the activity in question. Scientists have set this limit at 3. If the MET is less than or equal to 3, we'll say it's NEAT. We'll say it's non-exercise, and if the activity has a MET greater than 3, we'll say it's exercise, and so it will fall under EAT. Non-exercise activity thermogenesis will be the expenditure related to non-exercise activities. For example, that would be me talking right now, my hands moving, me typing on a keyboard, or simply walking. And so here I'm showing on screen the 10 NEAT activities that are most common in our daily lives. And so there's walking, standing, typing on a keyboard, and so on. And so what jumps out is that walking, meaning the number of steps, by far outperforms all other NEAT activities. By the way, something that makes me laugh a bit is seeing that dancing lightly with spontaneous movements is one of the most significant items in NEAT. So I'd love to know who dances in front of their mirror alone like a fool. I do it, okay? End of parenthesis. And I don't even want to get into the details of whether walking falls under NEAT or EAT. It's a pretty uninteresting debate. But what you need to know is that, as I told you, what differentiates an exercise from a non-exercise is the MET, the metabolic equivalent task, and that this limit was simply set at 3 and that walking is right at 3. So what you need to understand is that globally, if you walk at more than 5 kilometers per hour, you can consider it EAT. If you walk at less than 5 kilometers per hour, you can more or less consider it NEAT. But most of the time when we walk, we're still walking at less than 5 kilometers per hour. Okay, so we'll consider it's NEAT. And so what's interesting is that we can make a pretty acceptable approximation, which is that NEAT, in fact, comes down to the calories burned by your number of steps. And so we'll make this approximation that NEAT is the activity, the expenditure due to steps. What's also interesting, by the way, is that the more steps you take, the truer this approximation will be. Because the greater the number of steps, the greater the expenditure related to those steps. And the more the share of other activities in NEAT will shrink. And so the more your step activity increases, the more, in fact, well, the NEAT pie chart will shrink for other activities, and the truer this approximation will be. And so you'll need to track your number of steps every day. And we're in luck, because each of us is equipped with an excellent pedometer in our smartphones, whether it's on Android or on Apple. Now all smartphones are equipped with a pedometer thanks to very high quality accelerometry devices. And so you'll just have to download an app that counts your number of steps. Natively, for example, there's the Health app on the iPhone, or there's also the Google Fit app for Google devices, or Samsung Health for Samsung devices. Once you have your number of steps per day, you can finally deduce your NEAT. And here, be careful once again, you'll have to calculate your NEAT yourself, because yes, there's another huge trap. Connected devices like watches, treadmills, connected wristbands or others tend to greatly overestimate the calories burned. This is actually confirmed by quite a few studies, and I'll put one right here for you, which shows that the calories burned have error margins that approach 100%. So in fact, quite simply, double. Meaning that if you have a connected watch that shows you've burned 500 calories, well, in reality, there's a better chance you've only burned 250. So you have to be very careful. And so don't trust the calorie data provided by your electronic devices, and favor the raw data, like the number of steps, which is often very precise with current technologies. Here again, it can be complicated to calculate your NEAT, because NEAT will depend on your metabolism. And so any device that doesn't have access to your BMR and therefore to your body fat, well, will often calculate the calories burned from walking quite poorly. I use the Lean app, which integrates my BMR with my NEAT. And so it calculates my NEAT automatically based on the number of steps I take during the day. And that's why many of you have surely already seen, there's a big trend on YouTube and on social media in general right now about the number of steps. People are highlighting walking. And for good reason, because it's simply the easiest way, the most effective way to increase your daily expenditure and therefore potentially be in a deficit more easily. So now let's move on to EAT, exercise activity thermogenesis, which is the energy expended during your sports activities. Like NEAT, EAT depends on your BMR, and to calculate it, you'll need to find the MET, the metabolic equivalent of task associated with the sport you're going to perform. It's pretty easy to find. In any case, I'll put a link in the description. You can find charts online with the MET value for each sport. Once you've found the MET for your sport, you can use the following equation. EAT is equal to the MET times your BMR times the time spent exercising during your sport. So for me, for example, in the Lean app, I simply use the EAT section where I select the sport I've done. And for a cardio exercise, for example, I'll enter the time I actually spent doing that exercise. And for non-cardio sports, I'll enter the intensity I reached during an exercise. But be careful here. The time data in the EAT equation is the actual time you spent exercising. And I really mean actual, because this is one of the big pitfalls, especially if you do weight training. If you're doing weight training, the rest periods don't count. You should only count the time you spend actually lifting weights. Likewise, technically, if you play a racket sport, you need to enter the time you actually spent playing. Imagine you play an hour of tennis and you're an amateur. Well, in reality, you're only going to be playing for between 15 and 25 minutes. And so when you calculate your EAT, you have to consider that amount of time, 15 or 25 minutes. And so for weight training sessions, for me, for example, a workout will be somewhere between 200 and 250 calories, but not more. And here again, you have to be very careful. And this is something that made me plateau for years and years, overestimating the calories burned from exercise. And once again, be careful with connected devices. Connected devices tend to vastly overestimate the calories you burn during your workouts. And in fact, it's a bit like with NEAT. Often, the connected device won't calculate your correct metabolism, your correct BMR, because it only has access to your weight and not your body fat. And so it will often calculate your BMR with a formula like the Harris-Benedict, which is very often very bad and also overestimates the BMR. And so in the end, you have an EAT that is very inaccurate. Furthermore, one of the problems with connected devices is that they often consider the entire time of your sport and your session as a whole. When I told you to consider the time as the actual moment you were exercising in your sport, well, quite often the applications or connected devices that you are using simply do not really care about this detail. They'll only consider the entire duration of your session. And so an incorrect BMR plus a duration that's often 10 times longer than the time you actually exercised. And in the end, you're left with my Apple Watch, which for a long time was telling me my weight training sessions were over 1,050 calories. And so obviously that's wrong. And now you understand where this kind of problem comes from. And of course, you have to be careful because at first, when you have no idea about calories, you might think, why not? 1,000 calories for a workout, that sounds great to me. I'll be able to eat a lot. But in reality, no, we're very far from the truth. And as I said in my example, it can really ruin your entire diet. Let me give you a very simple example. My weight training session is 200 calories, and I consider the calories from my Apple Watch, which tells me, no, it's 1,000 calories. So there's a 5-fold margin of error. Let's imagine I start a slight deficit of about 100 calories per day, which means about 700 calories per week. Well, if you count a workout as being 1,000 calories instead of 200, then you've simply made a mistake of 800 calories. You've made a mistake that's almost the same as the deficit you wanted to create to lose weight, and so you don't lose any weight. So once again, don't make that mistake. Something else that's quite interesting is that most people, when they want to lose weight, they say, okay, I'm going to go hard at the gym, I'm going to do a ton of workouts, and that way I'll maximize my expenditure. First of all, high-intensity sports often aren't sports you can do for many days in a row. You have to be pretty careful with that. And so what I recommend is looking at the average calories burned per week and seeing how that fits into your overall TDE. For example, I do 5 weight training sessions a week, and my EAT actually only accounts for 5% of my TDEE. So I'm at about an average of 130 calories per day. And so that's quite interesting. So we often tend to think, okay, exercise is what's going to make me burn the most. But when you do sports like weight training, it's not necessarily what will help you burn the most calories. And so when I hear people say, well, I don't get it, I can't lose weight, even though I'm killing it at the gym, well, it's simply because it doesn't burn as many calories as you think. And one of the best ways to easily increase your expenditure without too much effort and without too much accumulated fatigue, well, that's walking. For me, for example, walking accounts for about 26% of my total daily expenditure. And so that's more than 600 calories on average per day. And so it's much more effective for losing weight in the long run. We're almost there, and we've reached the last component of TDEE expenditure, TF, the thermic effect of food. This is the energy your body expends to digest the food you give it. Often, by convention, it was said that TF was about 10% of the total calories ingested in a day, but in reality, in my opinion, that lacks a lot of precision. TF depends on the macronutrients that are ingested. For example, if you digest proteins, well, the TEF will be between 20 and 30% of the calories consumed. 5 to 10% for carbohydrates and 1 to 3% for lipids. What's immediately obvious is that proteins are a huge part of TF. If you consume 100 calories of protein, well, you're going to expend between 20 and 30 calories as TF for those proteins. And that's why the approximation that TF equals about 10% of the total global caloric intake bothers me a bit. Because if we take an average individual consumes 45% carbohydrates, 42% lipids, and 13% protein, and when you do the math, you're actually closer to a TEF of 7% of the total caloric intake than 10%. So you really have to be careful. There's still a 3% difference, which isn't negligible. For me, for example, I'm at about 3,000 calories a day. When you take 3% of that, it's still almost 100 calories. So you see, it's not negligible. And what's a shame is that in most calorie trackers, TEF isn't calculated. And so that's pretty problematic. And so you need to make sure you're using the right tool that correctly calculates your TEF. For me, for example, in my app, Lean, I track my food, and my exact TEF is calculated based on the foods I enter. So it gets pretty close to reality. It's much more precise. We finally have our complete expenditure. We have our TDEE. To calculate it, you simply have to add up each expenditure component. So TDEE will be equal to BMR plus NEAT plus EAT plus your TF. And now you have a precise value for your daily expenditure. But it's already been an obstacle course to get this far. And unfortunately, there's still one step left. It's kind of the final boss for calculating your TDEE perfectly, taking into account metabolic adaptation. This is probably one of the most subtle concepts to understand, but perhaps the most important one. When you want to lose fat and you're in a caloric deficit, well, your body will understand that it's receiving less energy, and so from a survival standpoint, it will adapt its metabolism. And so it will try to conserve as much energy as possible while perfectly maintaining your body's functions. It's exactly like the low power mode on your iPhone, for example, where you won't see a big difference when you use it, but in reality, it will consume much less energy. I'll put the numbers on the screen. This is roughly the effect of metabolic adaptation. For a deficit of about 250 calories per day, the metabolic adaptation over 2 to 8 weeks will be 5 to 10%. For a deficit of 500 calories per day, it's between 10 and 15% of metabolic adaptation. And for a deficit of 750 calories per day, between 15 and 25% of metabolic adaptation. And remember, your TDEE is made up of your BMR, your NEAT, and your EAT. And since NEAT and EAT also depend on BMR, it's actually almost your entire TDEE that's affected. So for example, if you don't account for metabolic adaptation, and in reality it's at 10% and you had planned for a 10% caloric deficit, well, you simply won't lose any weight and you'll be at maintenance. So, to illustrate this simply, imagine you've calculated your TDEE perfectly with all the tools I gave you before, and you've made sure to be in a caloric deficit, so you're well below your calculated TDEE. In reality, metabolic adaptation will affect your metabolism, increasing over the weeks, and your actual TD will be lower than your calculated TDE. And one of the problems that happens to 95% of people is that this metabolic adaptation is not taken into account. And you can very easily find yourself at caloric maintenance or even in a caloric surplus while being convinced you're in a caloric deficit because you've calculated your TDE correctly. In the number of times we face this confusion, where we think we're doing everything right, we think we're doing everything to lose weight perfectly, and we realize on the scale that our weight is increasing. It's a total misunderstanding. It's one of the worst feelings actually. It's happened to me countless times, and so most of the time it's because you haven't taken metabolic adaptation into account. I use the Lean app, which automatically calculates my metabolic adaptation as the weeks go by and according to the deficit I'm in. So that way, I don't have to worry about it. It calculates it automatically, and at least I'm sure I won't get stuck because of it. And so obviously, in practice, you'll need to set your deficit based on your actual TDEE and no longer on your calculated TDEE. There's something that's quite important, but it could be the topic of a whole other video, which is how to properly manage your metabolic adaptation. What I can advise you is that if you reach between 10 and 15% of metabolic adaptation, then what could be interesting is to go back to caloric maintenance. This will have the effect of resetting your BMR, your metabolism, which will return to 100%, and you can start fresh with a new deficit phase where you can lose weight. We too often think that weight loss is simply going to be a continuous, ever-decreasing curve over time, but in reality, a good practice is to have periods of decrease, then plateaus, then more periods of decrease, then plateaus, because in fact, we need to reset our BMR throughout the deficit, because otherwise, quite simply, the metabolic adaptation will become too great and too restrictive, and in fact, you'll reach a point where you can barely lose any more weight. You know how to perfectly determine your TDEE as close to reality as possible. And now you'll have to choose what deficit you're going to set for yourself in order to lose weight. Personally, what I can advise is to start, if possible, for the first few weeks, because we're often quite fired up. We're mentally ready for these deficit periods with a fairly large deficit, like for example, minus 500 kilocalories per day. And as the weeks go on, lower that deficit and maybe gradually move towards minus 250 calories, minus 200, minus 150 later on. And so, since you've calculated your TDEE very precisely, you'll just have to apply this deficit to know the number of kilocalories to consume per day. With the Lean app, it's quite simple for me. It automatically calculates my daily TDEE, and I can even see it increase throughout the day. And so, I just have to adapt my calorie intake throughout the day to reach my goals and make sure I'm in a caloric deficit. There are many ways to track your calories. The most common one is to have access to a food database where you'll choose the foods and enter the weight of each item. You can also scan a barcode on products you'd find at the supermarket. But I have to admit, my favorite thing right now is being able to simply scan my meal with a single photo using the Lean app. It directly calculates the calories with all the macronutrients for each food item on my plate. And I have to say that's super practical. I have to do almost absolutely nothing to track my calories. And in terms of adherence, it's just perfect. And when I'm eating out, for example, or at a restaurant, well, it's just super convenient. I just have to take a picture, it's no hassle, and then all my calories show up right away. So yes, of course, it's less precise than scanning a food with a barcode and weighing your food and so on, but I have to admit, for me, it more than does the job. And we can't forget that the number one principle is adherence. You have to be able to stick with it for the long haul. And so the simple act of taking a photo to track your calories, well, it's a game changer. It saves us a huge amount of time, and especially in terms of hassle, in terms of managing your mental health, well, it's absolutely incredible. And in the long run, it helps us stick with it. And in the end, that's what's most important. And you'll notice that throughout this whole video, I still haven't touched on the subject of macronutrients, except for a little bit at one point for the TEF, the thermic effect of food. And that's intentional because one of the big problems you see in a lot of videos that try to teach you how to create good diets is that they'll talk about calories, and right after that, they'll talk about macronutrients, then micronutrients, and so on. I intentionally saved that for the end because I don't want us to skip any steps. If the first step, which is to perfectly calculate your TDEE and then your calories, isn't followed, everything else that comes after is useless, meaning nothing will work if you're not even sure whether you're in a caloric deficit or surplus. So trying to hyper-optimize what comes next is pointless. So I want to emphasize this. The golden rule: the first thing you must do is to know your TDE and your calories well, and to know exactly whether you're in a deficit, at maintenance, or in a surplus. Now we can talk a little about macronutrients. Indeed, it's going to be very interesting. It's the advice everyone gives, but it's very good, and that is to increase your protein level if possible. For one, it will prevent muscle catabolism, which is very beneficial, but also, as we saw with the TF, proteins play a huge role in the TF. You'll burn between 20 and 30% of the calories you consume from protein, and so that will allow you to have a substantial food volume by eating a lot of protein and increase your TF at the same time. For me, for example, in lean, my technique is to set it to balanced, which is kind of the default setting, but it works very well for me. That means setting it to 2.2 grams of protein per kilo of lean mass and 1 gram of fat per kilo of lean mass, with the rest being carbs. You can also try out many different diets if you use the same app: low carb, high fat, high protein, and so on. I know that a balanced diet works perfectly for me. It's time to wrap up this video, and to do that, we're going to go through a little checklist on how to stay lean, how to lose fat. You've set aside the Harris-Benedict equation and opted for much more modern formulas that use body fat as an input. Body fat that you now know how to calculate with body fat scans, like the one offered by the Lean app, for example. You know how to precisely calculate your NEAT based on your step count and your metabolism, your BMR. You also know how to perfectly calculate your EAT based on the exercise you do each week and your metabolism, your BMR. And you know how to very easily track your calories, either with databases or with a simple photo of your plate each day. From all these elements, you can deduce your BMR, your NEAT, your EAT, and your TIF. And of course, taking into account metabolic adaptation, as I've shown you in this video. All that's left is to set a goal for a deficit, maintenance, or surplus, and manage your calories to easily reach your goal. I use the Lean app, which allows me to do all these calculations in the background without me having to do anything, and so it makes my life so much easier. Back in the day, I used to use Excel spreadsheets to track all my data: steps, calories, BMR, metabolic adaptation, and so on. And in terms of adherence, I have to admit it wasn't great, but now I've downloaded this app, and I have to admit that for now, it is, I think, the best find I've made in recent years, and it makes my life so much easier. That's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. To the most dedicated among you for staying until the end of this video. If you have any particular video topics, or if you'd even like to have a debate, feel free to post a comment and I'll be there to reply. I hope I've been able to give you all the tools to finally get lean, get shredded, whether you're a man or a woman. In any case, it was a pleasure for me to spend this time with you. See you very soon.